December 7, 1944. The Ardennes forest stretched endlessly beneath a steel-grey sky, its frozen branches crackling under the weight of fresh snow. Staff Sergeant James Williams of the 761st Tank Battalion crouched beside his M4 Sherman, listening to the eerie silence that had settled over the Belgian countryside. The German armed forces of that era had launched their massive winter offensive just hours earlier, and Williams knew that somewhere in those dense woods, enemy forces were advancing with a confidence born from years of military dominance. What the German military leadership at that time could never have anticipated was that their carefully planned assault would encounter an obstacle unlike any they had faced before, not through overwhelming firepower or superior numbers, but through a method so unexpected that it would fundamentally challenge everything their tactical doctrine had taught them about modern conflict. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 72 hours, one soldier's innovation would transform a desperate defensive position into a masterclass in psychological operations, demonstrating that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not the one that makes the most noise, but the one that creates the most uncertainty. James Williams had learned patience long before he ever set foot on European soil. Born in 1922 in rural Mississippi, he had grown up understanding that survival often meant knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to observe. The segregated units of the American Armed Forces during that era had taught him another lesson entirely, that proving your worth meant performing at a level beyond what was expected, because anything less would be used as evidence of inadequacy. His path to the 761st Tank Battalion had been neither easy nor straightforward, but by the time he found himself in Belgium during that bitter December, Williams had developed a reputation among his fellow soldiers as someone who thought differently, who saw angles that others missed. The 761st was one of the few African-American tank battalions deployed in the European theater, and they had already proven themselves in combat across France during the autumn campaigns. Williams served as a gunner on a Sherman tank nicknamed Lady Luck, a 30-ton steel beast that had carried them through 3 months of nearly continuous action. His commander, Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, was a former schoolteacher from Philadelphia who had earned his commission through Officer Candidate School. The driver, Corporal Eddie Martinez from Texas, could navigate terrain that would have stopped most other operators. The loader, Private First Class Robert Hayes from Chicago, could maintain a rate of fire that seemed almost impossible given the cramped conditions inside the turret. Together, they had developed the kind of coordination that only comes from shared hardship and mutual trust. But on that December morning, as reports filtered through of the massive German offensive that would later be called the Battle of the Bulge, even their experienced crew felt the weight of uncertainty. The German forces during that period had committed nearly 300,000 troops to this surprise attack, supported by hundreds of armored vehicles and artillery pieces. Their objective was to split the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp, potentially changing the entire trajectory of the European conflict. What made this assault particularly dangerous was not just its scale, but its timing and location. The Ardennes had been considered a quiet sector, lightly defended because the terrain was deemed unsuitable for large-scale armored operations. The German military leadership at that time had counted on this assumption, and their initial advance had achieved complete tactical surprise. The 761st Tank Battalion found itself rushed forward to help establish defensive positions near the town of Bastogne, a critical road junction that the advancing forces needed to secure for their offensive to succeed. Williams and his crew were assigned to a position overlooking a narrow valley, one of several likely approach routes for enemy armor. The location offered good fields of fire but limited cover, and everyone understood that if German armored vehicles appeared in force, their single Sherman would be hopelessly outnumbered. Thompson gathered his crew as they prepared their position. The fog was so thick you could barely see 50 meters ahead, he observed, studying the terrain through his binoculars. That works both ways, though. They cannot see us any better than we can see them. Williams nodded, but his mind was already working through the tactical problem they faced. In a conventional engagement, Their Sherman would get off perhaps 3 or 4 shots before enemy forces identified their position and brought overwhelming fire to bear. The M4 Sherman was reliable and well designed, but it was outgunned by the heavier German armor of that period. Its 75mm main gun was effective against infantry and lighter vehicles, but struggled against the frontal armor of heavier enemy designs. Their survival would depend not on winning a direct confrontation, but on avoiding one for as long as possible, while inflicting maximum damage. As Martinez maneuvered Lady Luck into a hull-down position behind a low ridge, Williams studied the valley below with growing concern. The morning mist clung to the ground like a living thing, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of the road that wound through the frozen landscape. It was perfect weather for an advance, poor visibility, that would help attacking forces close the distance before defenders could effectively engage them. But as Williams watched the patterns of fog drift and swirl, an idea began to form in his mind, one that seemed almost absurdly simple, yet potentially revolutionary in its implications. That evening, as the crew performed maintenance on their tank and prepared for the long night ahead, Williams approached Thompson with his proposal. The lieutenant listened carefully, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest as Williams laid out his thinking. "It contradicts everything we have been taught about defensive operations," Thompson said slowly. "Doctrine says we should engage targets as soon as they enter effective range, maintain a high rate of fire, and use our mobility to reposition after making contact." Williams met his commander's gaze steadily. "Doctrine assumes we have support," he replied quietly. "Doctrine assumes we are not alone on this ridge with ammunition for maybe 15 to 20 engagements and no guarantee of resupply. Doctrine assumes the enemy does not outnumber us 10 to 1. The silence stretched between them as Thompson considered the implications. Finally, the lieutenant nodded. "We will try it your way," he said. "But if this goes wrong, we may not get a second chance." Williams understood the unspoken message. In a segregated military, failure would be judged more harshly. Success would need to be undeniable. He had learned long ago that African American soldiers in that era carried a burden beyond just their military duties. They carried the weight of representation, of proving something that should never have needed proving in the first place. The plan Williams had proposed was deceptively straightforward. Instead of engaging enemy forces immediately when they appeared, Lady Luck would wait in complete silence, allowing targets to advance into the valley until multiple vehicles were committed to the approach. Only then would they fire, and when they did, they would follow a specific pattern designed to create maximum psychological impact while minimizing their own exposure. The key was patience and discipline, something Williams had in abundance, but that went against every instinct of conventional armored warfare. Martinez was the first to voice his concerns when Williams explained the plan to the full crew. "You want us to let them get how close?" he asked incredulously. Williams had calculated the optimal engagement range based on the terrain and firing positions, close enough that their 75mm gun would be devastating, but far enough that they would still have reaction time if something went wrong. Hayes, the loader, looked equally uncertain. "If we wait that long and miss, we will have half a dozen enemy vehicles shooting back before we can reload." Thompson intervened before the discussion could become an argument. "Williams has thought this through," he said firmly. "We trust each other. That is what has kept us alive this long, so we trust him on this." The first test of Williams's method came the following morning, just after dawn when the fog was at its thickest. The crew had spent a sleepless night taking turns on watch, their nerves stretched taut by every sound that drifted up from the valley. Williams was on the gun when Martinez, peering through the driver's periscope, suddenly tensed. "Movement," he whispered over the intercom. "Southeast coming up the road." Thompson raised his periscope carefully, searching the mist. "I see them," he confirmed. 4 vehicles. Looks like Panzer IVs moving in column formation." The German Panzer IV medium tank was a formidable opponent, mounting a long-barreled 75mm gun of its own and protected by frontal armor that could defeat many Allied anti-tank weapons. 4 of them represented a serious threat, especially in the confined terrain of the valley where Lady Luck would have limited room to maneuver. Williams tracked the lead vehicle through his sight, his finger resting lightly near the trigger. Every instinct screamed at him to fire, to engage while they had surprise and a clean shot. But he held his breath and waited. The range closed. 1,000 meters, 800 meters, 600 meters. The German column continued forward, clearly confident that the approach was undefended. Williams could see details now through his sight. The commander in the lead tank had his hatch open, scanning ahead with binoculars. The crews were buttoned up otherwise, a standard precaution, but one that would slow their reaction time if they came under fire. 500 meters, 450 meters. Thompson's voice came over the intercom, tight with tension. "Williams." "Almost there," Williams replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. 400 meters, 375 meters. "Now," Williams said quietly, and squeezed the trigger. The Sherman's main gun roared, the entire tank rocking back with the recoil. The armor-piercing round crossed the distance in less than a second, striking the lead Panzer IV squarely on its turret side. The German tank shuddered and stopped, smoke beginning to pour from its hatches. Round loaded. Hayes shouted immediately. Williams was already tracking the second vehicle, which had lurched to a halt behind the leader. The crew was clearly confused, unable to determine where the shot had come from through the dense fog. Williams fired again, and the second tank erupted in flames as the round penetrated its thinner side armor. Then Williams did something that contradicted every standard tactical procedure. He stopped shooting. "Hold fire," he commanded. Complete silence. "Everyone stay absolutely still." The two surviving Panzer IVs had reversed frantically, their commanders desperately trying to locate the source of the ambush. But Lady Luck sat in perfect stillness. No engine noise, no movement, no follow-up shots to give away their position. Through his sight, Williams watched the German crews scanning the ridgeline, their guns traversing back and forth as they searched for a target. One of them fired blindly at a cluster of trees several hundred meters from Lady Luck's actual position, the round exploding harmlessly in the forest. After nearly 5 minutes of fruitless searching, the two surviving German tanks withdrew rapidly down the road, their commanders clearly shaken by an attack that had seemed to come from nowhere. Thompson let out a long breath. "They have no idea where we are," he said wonderingly. Williams allowed himself a small smile. "That is the point," he replied. "By the time they report this, they will not know if they faced 1 tank or 10, if we are on this ridge or somewhere else entirely. The uncertainty is our weapon now." Over the next 3 days, Williams and his crew refined their method into an art form. Each engagement followed the same pattern: absolute silence until targets were deep into the killing zone, devastating accuracy on the first shots, then immediate cessation of fire and complete stillness. The psychological effect on German forces attempting to move through that sector was profound and cumulative. Commanders became increasingly reluctant to commit their vehicles to approaches where they might face this invisible, impossibly patient opponent. Reconnaissance elements reported conflicting information about Allied defensive positions, with some claiming they had faced an entire platoon of tanks, while others insisted the attacks came from mobile anti-tank guns that disappeared after firing. The crew developed an almost telepathic understanding of Williams's method. Martinez learned to position the tank so that they always had multiple firing positions prepared, allowing them to engage from slightly different locations to further confuse enemy intelligence. He became expert at reading terrain, identifying not just where Lady Luck could hide, but how the natural contours of the land would affect sound propagation and visual detection. He studied the way fog moved through the valley, learning to predict when visibility would be at its worst, and timing their repositioning movements accordingly. His skill at maneuvering the 30-ton Sherman into and out of position without making excessive noise became legendary among the battalion, with other drivers seeking his advice on technique and approach. Hayes mastered the art of reloading with absolute silence, eliminating even the small metallic sounds that might give away their presence. He developed a system for arranging ammunition within the turret that minimized movement and contact between shells, padding contact points with cloth to muffle any unavoidable sounds. He learned to anticipate Williams's target selection, preparing the appropriate type of round before it was called for, shaving precious seconds off their engagement time. His loading speed under these constrained conditions actually improved compared to conventional combat situations, as the methodical discipline of the approach allowed him to move with precision rather than frantic haste. Thompson coordinated with other units in the sector, sharing intelligence about German movements while protecting the secret of their defensive technique. He understood that the effectiveness of Williams's method depended partially on its unfamiliarity, on enemy forces not understanding what they were facing or developing specific counter-tactics. He filed after-action reports that accurately described the results of engagements, but carefully avoided providing details about the specific techniques that produced those results. He deflected questions from commanders in other units who were curious about how a single tank crew was achieving such disproportionate effects, suggesting that it was primarily a matter of good positioning and fortunate circumstances rather than a replicable method. But as the days passed and the results continued to accumulate, Thompson recognized that the method was too valuable to keep entirely secret. He began working with battalion leadership to develop a training program that could teach the essential principles to other crews without compromising operational security. This required distilling Williams's approach into communicable components, identifying which elements were transferable skills versus which depended on Williams's particular combination of talent and experience. It meant understanding not just what Williams did, but why he made specific choices, what indicators he relied upon, how he calculated risks and balanced competing factors. The training sessions Thompson organized for other crews revealed both the power and the challenges of Williams's method. Some crews grasped the principles quickly, demonstrating the patience and discipline required to implement the approach effectively. Others struggled with the counterintuitive nature of holding fire when targets were available, their training and instincts pushing them toward immediate engagement even when they intellectually understood the tactical advantages of waiting. Thompson observed that the crews most successful in adopting the method were often those who had already demonstrated qualities of thoughtfulness and self-control in other contexts, suggesting that the method required not just technical skills, but particular psychological characteristics. One crew that particularly excelled in learning Williams' approach was commanded by Lieutenant Samuel Jackson, an African-American officer from New York who had taught philosophy at a small college before the conflict. Jackson immediately understood the deeper principles underlying the method, recognizing parallels with strategic thinking in other domains. He described it to his crew as applied game theory, anticipating opponent reactions and structuring your own actions to shape their decision-making process. By creating uncertainty about your capabilities and location, you force them into increasingly cautious and defensive postures that limit their own effectiveness. Jackson and Williams spent considerable time discussing the method and its implications, conversations that helped Williams articulate aspects of his thinking that had remained largely intuitive. Jackson pushed him to explain not just what he did, but how he decided what to do, what mental models he relied upon, how he processed information during the intense stress of engagement. These discussions proved valuable, not just for Jackson's own implementation of the method, but for the broader effort to codify and teach it to others. Williams discovered that the process of explaining his approach to someone with Jackson's analytical mindset helped him understand his own thinking more clearly. The partnership between Williams and Jackson illustrated something important about innovation and its transmission. Williams had developed the method through a combination of tactical analysis, combat experience, and insights shaped by his life experiences navigating a discriminatory society. Jackson, with his academic background and philosophical training, could help translate that innovation into frameworks and language that made it more accessible to others. Neither could have accomplished alone what they achieved together, Williams creating the innovation and Jackson helping to systematize and communicate it in ways that enabled broader adoption. As word of the method's effectiveness spread through the American defensive lines, it began to influence operations beyond just tank crews. Infantry units adapted the principles of patient discipline and psychological pressure to their own defensive positions, learning to let enemy patrols advance deeper before engaging, creating similar effects of uncertainty and disruption. Artillery observers applied the concept of selective fire, sometimes holding back to create doubt about defensive capabilities rather than immediately responding to every target opportunity. The psychological warfare value of calculated restraint became a recognized principle across multiple domains of military operations. On the third day, Williams encountered a situation that would test his method in ways none of them had anticipated. A column of more than a dozen German vehicles appeared on the road, a major force clearly intended to punch through the American defensive line. Through his sight, Williams could see not just armored vehicles, but also trucks carrying infantry, support vehicles, and what appeared to be a mobile command post. This was not a reconnaissance element or a small assault force. It was a significant portion of a German battle group, and they were moving with the confidence of a unit that expected no serious opposition. Thompson's voice over the intercom was strained. "Williams, this is too many. If we engage, they will overwhelm us within minutes." But Williams had already calculated the variables, the spacing of the vehicles, the terrain features that would limit their movement, the distance to their prepared fallback position. There was a way to make this work, but it would require perfect timing and nerves of steel from the entire crew. "We can do this," he said quietly. "But we have to trust the method completely. No early shots, no matter what. Do I have everyone's commitment?" One by one, the crew members acknowledged, their voices tight but determined. Martinez positioned Lady Luck with meticulous care, ensuring they had the best possible firing angle while remaining concealed. Hayes prepared rounds in sequence, arranging them for maximum loading speed. Thompson marked targets and calculated firing solutions, his pre-war teaching experience showing in his methodical approach. And Williams settled into the patient stillness that had become his trademark, breathing slowly and steadily as the German column advanced into the valley. The range closed with agonizing slowness. Williams let the lead vehicles pass the ideal firing position, waiting until the column was strung out along the road, with multiple targets crowded together in the narrow valley. He could see German soldiers in the trucks, young men who probably believed they were advancing toward a weakly defended position. Officers stood in vehicle hatches, studying maps and directing movement. The mobile command post had stopped briefly to coordinate the advance, its radio antennas clearly visible even through the fog. Williams made his calculations with cold precision. The command post first, to disrupt coordination. Then the lead armored vehicle to block the road forward. Then the rear vehicle to trap the column in place. After that, it would be chaos. And chaos was what he needed. "Firing now," he said calmly, and the Sherman's gun spoke. The first round struck the mobile command post with devastating accuracy, the vehicle erupting in flames as its fuel and ammunition stores ignited. Before the sound of the explosion had faded, Hayes had reloaded, and Williams had shifted to his next target. The lead Panzer IV took a round through its rear deck, the hit penetrating into the engine compartment and bringing the vehicle to an immediate halt. 5 seconds later, the rear guard vehicle suffered the same fate, and suddenly the entire German column was trapped on a narrow road with burning wrecks at both ends. Then Williams fell silent again, Lady Luck sitting motionless, as the German force reacted with understandable panic. Vehicle commanders buttoned up their hatches as infantry scattered into the ditches alongside the road. Armored vehicles traversed their turrets wildly, searching for targets but seeing only fog and trees. One tank fired at movement in the forest, its shot striking nothing but frozen earth. Another reversed directly into a truck behind it, creating further confusion. Williams watched through his sight, utterly still, as the German force spent several minutes in complete disarray. Then, just as their officers began to restore order and direct return fire toward the general direction of the ridge, he fired again. A single shot, taking out another armored vehicle that had been attempting to maneuver off the road. Then silence once more, so complete that the Germans must have questioned whether they were facing actual tanks or some new type of weapon they did not understand. This pattern continued for nearly 20 minutes, Williams firing single shots at carefully selected targets, then fading back into invisibility. Each time the German force attempted to organize a response, another precise round would shatter their efforts and force them to start over. The psychological impact was devastating. Commanders found themselves unable to predict when or where the next shot would come from, unable to mass their return fire effectively, unable to even confirm how many opponents they faced or exactly where those opponents were positioned. Finally, with nearly half their vehicles destroyed or disabled and their command structure in complete chaos, the surviving elements of the German column withdrew in disorder. Williams and his crew sat in absolute silence for another 10 minutes after the last enemy vehicle disappeared, making sure there were no follow-up elements or observers who might locate their position. When Thompson finally gave the all-clear, the crew's hands were shaking from the intensity of sustained concentration and controlled aggression they had maintained. Martinez was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. "I counted 13 vehicles that we stopped or destroyed," he said slowly. 13 vehicles from a single tank position, and they never once came close to identifying our exact location. Hayes shook his head in disbelief as he surveyed the expended shell casings around his loader position. "We should not have survived that," he said quietly. "By every tactical calculation, they should have overwhelmed us within the first 5 minutes." But Williams understood something that conventional military doctrine of that era often overlooked. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that forces your opponent to fight the battle primarily in their own mind. The German commanders in that valley had not been defeated by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. They had been defeated by uncertainty, by the inability to formulate a clear picture of what they were facing, by the growing conviction that any movement might draw fire from a source they could not locate or counter effectively. The silence between shots had been more devastating than the shots themselves, because it created a space where fear and doubt could multiply unchecked. Over the following days, word of Williams's method spread through the American defensive lines. Other tank commanders began adopting similar approaches, learning that patience and psychological pressure could multiply their effectiveness even when facing superior numbers. The German forces attempting to advance through that sector found themselves increasingly hesitant, their progress slowing as commanders became reluctant to commit their units to approaches where they might encounter this new form of defense. Intelligence reports from captured German soldiers revealed a growing mythology around the American tank crews in the Ardennes, with some units claiming they had faced entire battalions of invisible tanks that could strike from any direction without warning. But the toll of this method on Williams and his crew was significant and growing. The intense concentration required to maintain absolute discipline during engagements, the constant awareness that a single mistake could be fatal, the accumulated stress of repeated combat without the release of sustained action, all of it wore on them in ways that conventional fighting did not. Hayes developed a tremor in his hands that only appeared after engagements. Martinez reported difficulty sleeping, his mind unable to shut off the hypervigilance that had kept them alive. Even Thompson, normally unshakable in his command decisions, showed signs of the strain. Williams himself felt the weight of responsibility in ways he had never experienced before. Each engagement meant calculating risks not just for his own crew, but potentially for the entire defensive sector that depended on their ability to hold their position. Every decision about when to fire and when to remain silent carried life or death consequences for soldiers he would never meet. The burden of innovation is that you carry not only your own survival, but also the validation or condemnation of your entire approach. And in a segregated military, Williams understood that his performance would be judged as representative of far more than just his individual capabilities. On December 16th, exactly 9 days after the German offensive had begun, Williams and his crew received orders to fall back to a new defensive line. The strategic situation had stabilized somewhat as American reinforcements arrived in the sector, and Lady Luck was to be relieved by fresh units. As they prepared to withdraw from the position they had held for more than a week, Thompson conducted a final assessment of what they had accomplished. Based on confirmed reports and direct observation, he told the crew, "This single tank position was responsible for stopping or destroying more than 40 enemy vehicles, disrupting at least 6 separate German advances, and holding a critical approach route that the enemy never managed to successfully exploit despite numerous attempts." Martinez whistled softly. 40 vehicles. That is more than some entire battalions accomplish in weeks of combat. But Hayes looked at Williams with a more complex expression. "At what cost, though?" he asked quietly. What does it do to a person to fight that way? To make yourself into something that can sit absolutely still while enemy forces advance, knowing that everything depends on your ability to remain calm and patient even when every instinct screams at you to act. Williams did not have a good answer for that question. He knew that what they had accomplished was tactically significant, potentially even revolutionary in its implications for defensive doctrine. But he also knew that the method had demanded something from each of them that was difficult to quantify or describe. It had required them to become comfortable with a level of calculated coldness that sat uneasily alongside their fundamental humanity. It had forced them to perfect the art of choosing when to take life and when to hold back, making each decision with full awareness of its consequences. As Lady Luck rumbled toward the rear areas, Williams found himself reflecting on an uncomfortable truth. The segregated military structure of that era had taught him and his fellow African-American soldiers that they would have to be better than good to be considered equal, that they would have to innovate and excel beyond standard expectations to earn respect that should have been granted automatically. His method had emerged partly from tactical necessity, but also from a lifetime of learning to see angles that others missed, to find advantages in situations where the obvious paths were closed off, to prove worth through undeniable results, because the assumption of worth was not freely given. The irony was not lost on him. He had developed a combat method that was now being adopted by units across the sector. His innovation was saving American lives and disrupting enemy operations in measurable ways. Yet he knew that when the history of this conflict was eventually written, the contributions of segregated units would likely be minimized or forgotten, reduced to footnotes in a larger narrative that did not have space for the complexity of their experience. Success in combat did not automatically translate to equality in society, and the same military structure that benefited from his innovations maintained the discriminatory policies that had shaped his entire service experience. When they reached the rear area staging point, Williams and his crew were surprised to find a group of officers waiting for them, including a colonel from division headquarters. The colonel approached Thompson and spoke briefly, then turned to address the entire crew. His expression was serious as he began. "Gentlemen, I have reviewed the after-action reports from your sector, and I want you to understand that what you accomplished over the past 9 days is being studied as a potential model for defensive operations across the entire front. The method you developed has already been credited with slowing enemy advances in multiple sectors and is being incorporated into tactical guidance for other units." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I am aware that you face challenges in this military that have nothing to do with your capabilities as soldiers, challenges that should not exist. I cannot change the larger structure within which we operate, but I can ensure that your accomplishments are properly documented and recognized. Staff Sergeant Williams, your innovation represents exactly the kind of tactical thinking that wins conflicts." Williams accepted the recognition with quiet dignity, but he also understood what was not being said. The colonel's acknowledgement was genuine and appreciated, but it existed within a context that remained fundamentally unchanged. The military would adopt his method, would benefit from his innovation, but would continue to maintain segregated units and discriminatory policies. Recognition was not the same as equality, and accomplishment did not automatically translate to justice. Over the following weeks, as the Allied forces gradually pushed back the German offensive and regained lost ground, Williams's method continued to prove its worth. Tank crews trained specifically in the patience and discipline required to implement it effectively, understanding that the silence between shots was as tactically important as the shots themselves. Enemy forces advancing through defended sectors found themselves facing an opponent that seemed to operate by rules they could not fully understand. That combined devastating accuracy with an almost supernatural ability to remain undetected between engagements. The psychological impact on German forces during this period was documented in numerous intelligence reports and interrogations of captured soldiers. Many described a growing sense of dread when advancing through certain sectors, a conviction that they were being observed and tracked by an opponent who could strike at any moment but chose to wait for maximum effect. Some units reported that their commanders had become increasingly reluctant to commit forces to approaches where they might encounter this form of defense, effectively ceding tactical initiative to American forces who might be outnumbered, but who had found a method to multiply their effectiveness through psychological pressure and patient discipline. But perhaps the most significant impact of Williams's innovation was not immediately visible in tactical reports or combat assessments. It was in the way it challenged certain assumptions about what was required for military effectiveness. The method demonstrated that sometimes the most sophisticated weapon system was not advanced technology, but human judgment, that firepower mattered less than the wisdom to know when to employ it. That patience and psychological understanding could be as decisive as armor thickness or gun caliber. These were lessons that transcended the specific circumstances of defensive operations in the Ardennes, lessons that would influence military thinking for generations to come. In late January of 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge concluded with the German forces driven back to their original positions and the Allied offensive preparing to resume, the 761st Tank Battalion was pulled out of frontline service for rest and refit. Williams and his crew spent several weeks in a rear area, conducting maintenance on Lady Luck and training replacement crews in the methods they had developed. The experience of teaching others what had emerged from necessity and innovation gave Williams a new perspective on what they had accomplished. He watched young soldiers practice the discipline of holding fire, of remaining absolutely still while simulated targets moved into engagement range, of calculating the psychological impact of their actions on an unseen opponent. Many struggled with the counterintuitive nature of the method, their training and instincts pushing them toward immediate action rather than patient calculation. Williams found himself explaining not just the tactical mechanics, but the underlying philosophy, the understanding that defeating an opponent sometimes meant first defeating their certainty, creating doubt and confusion that would make them vulnerable to precisely applied force. Thompson observed these training sessions with interest, occasionally asking Williams to elaborate on specific aspects of his thinking. During one such conversation, the lieutenant posed a question that had clearly been occupying his thoughts. "Do you think they will remember this?" he asked. "Not just the tactical method, but the fact that it came from a segregated unit, from soldiers who had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy." Williams considered the question carefully before responding. "I think they will remember the method," he said slowly. "Whether they remember or acknowledge where it came from, that is less certain. History has a way of smoothing over the complications and focusing on the outcomes that fit existing narratives." Thompson nodded slowly, his expression troubled. "That is what concerns me," he admitted, "that we will have contributed something genuinely valuable, something that saves lives and changes how people think about combat operations, and it will be absorbed into the larger story without acknowledgement of the context that shaped it, without recognition that sometimes the best innovations come from those who have been forced to see problems differently because the conventional paths were not open to them." The conversation stayed with Williams long after it ended. He understood that his contribution to military tactics was real and significant, that his method would likely be studied and taught long after the specific circumstances of its origin were forgotten. But he also understood that there was a larger story here, one about how discrimination and segregation created conditions that paradoxically sometimes forced innovation, how necessity born from injustice could produce advances that benefited the very system that had created that injustice in the first place. It was a complexity that simple recognition or medals could not fully address. In March of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into Germany and the end of the European conflict came into view, Williams and Lady Luck were back in action, this time supporting the advance rather than defending against it. The lessons learned in the Ardennes proved adaptable to offensive operations, with the same principles of patience and psychological pressure applied in different tactical contexts. Williams found himself sought out by commanders from other units, asked to explain his thinking, and train their crews in the method that had proven so effective. One such conversation, with a white tank commander from a different battalion, crystallized many of Williams's thoughts about what they had accomplished and what it meant. The commander, a captain from Massachusetts, listened intently as Williams explained the core principles of the method, then asked a question that showed unusual insight. "This is not really about tactics, is it?" the captain said thoughtfully. "I mean, it is tactically sound and obviously effective, but at its core it is about understanding your opponent's psychology, about recognizing that military forces are made up of human beings who experience fear and uncertainty and doubt. It is about using those human factors as deliberately as you would use terrain or weather or firepower." Williams nodded slowly, appreciating that the captain had grasped something essential. "That is exactly right," he confirmed. "We think of warfare as being about weapons and numbers and training, and all of those things matter. But ultimately it is human beings making decisions under pressure, and if you can influence how they perceive their situation, you can change those decisions without necessarily changing the objective circumstances. The silence between shots is powerful because it creates space for doubt to grow, for certainty to erode, for fear to multiply." The captain studied Williams with an expression that mixed respect with something else, perhaps recognition of the complexity that the military structure carefully avoided acknowledging. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked finally. Williams met his gaze steadily, choosing his words with care. "You learn it when you grow up understanding that the world sees you differently than you see yourself, when you have to constantly calculate how your actions will be perceived and judged by standards that do not apply equally to everyone. You learn to think several moves ahead, to anticipate how others will react, to find advantages in situations where the obvious paths are closed off. You learn that perception matters as much as reality, sometimes more." The captain held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I am beginning to understand," he said quietly. "What you developed in the Ardennes did not come from nowhere. It came from a lifetime of experience that most of us do not have, cannot fully understand without having lived it ourselves. The military is benefiting from that experience, from those insights, while maintaining structures that created the conditions for them to develop in the first place." The recognition suddenly made the air between them feel heavy with unspoken truths. As the European conflict drew toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, Williams found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him from rural Mississippi to the battlefields of Europe, from a society that denied him basic rights to a military that needed his innovation even while maintaining discriminatory policies. The contradiction was profound and inescapable, and he understood that it would not be resolved by individual recognition or tactical success, however significant those might be. Real change would require confronting the fundamental structures that created such contradictions in the first place. In May of 1945, when the conflict in Europe finally ended, the 761st Tank Battalion prepared for redeployment, initially expecting to be sent to the Pacific Theater, but ultimately remaining in occupation duties in Germany. Williams and his crew found themselves among the forces tasked with maintaining order and supporting reconstruction in the defeated nation. The irony of African-American soldiers helping to rebuild a country that had been controlled by a regime whose racial ideology was even more extreme than the discrimination they faced at home was not lost on any of them. During this period, Williams had several encounters with German civilians and former soldiers that gave him additional perspective on what his method had accomplished. On one occasion, a former German tank commander who had fought in the Ardennes specifically mentioned the American defensive tactics that had so thoroughly disrupted their winter offensive. "We could not understand it," the German officer explained in halting English. "Every tactical principle we had been taught said that defenders should engage as soon as possible, maintain constant fire, and use mobility to avoid being pinned down. But the American tanks in some sectors did none of those things. They waited until we were committed, struck with devastating accuracy, then disappeared so completely that we could not locate them or predict their next attack. It was like fighting ghosts, and it broke our confidence more thoroughly than any conventional defense could have." Williams listened to this assessment with mixed feelings. On one hand, it confirmed the effectiveness of his method and its psychological impact on enemy forces. On the other hand, it highlighted how innovations born from necessity and shaped by experiences of discrimination could be appreciated for their tactical value, while the deeper context that produced them remained largely invisible to those who benefited most from them. The German officer saw the effectiveness of the method, but could not fully understand the lifetime of experiences and perspectives that had made it possible for Williams to conceive of such an approach in the first place. As the months of occupation duty continued, Williams began to think more seriously about what would come after military service. He understood that returning to civilian life in the American South would mean returning to many of the same discriminatory conditions that had shaped his youth, that the respect and recognition he had earned in combat would not automatically translate to equal treatment at home. The Double V campaign, which called for victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, had resonated with many African American soldiers precisely because they understood that military service alone would not guarantee equality or justice. Thompson, who had become not just Williams's commander, but also his friend through shared hardship and mutual respect, discussed this challenge openly during one of their last conversations before the battalion began preparations for return to the United States. "You changed how the military thinks about defensive operations," Thompson said seriously. "That is not a small thing. It will be taught at tactical schools studied by commanders, probably save lives for decades to come. But I know that does not automatically translate to the recognition or opportunities you deserve once we are home." Williams appreciated the acknowledgement, the willingness to speak directly about realities that many preferred to avoid. "I learned something important during this conflict," he replied thoughtfully. "I learned that innovation often comes from seeing problems from angles that conventional thinking misses, that sometimes the best solutions emerge from those who have been forced to develop different perspectives because the standard approaches were not available to them. That is a lesson that applies far beyond military tactics. The question is whether the larger society will recognize that truth or continue to assume that valuable insights can only come from those who already hold positions of authority and privilege." The question hung in the air between them, profound and difficult, because both men understood that the answer was not one they could control or even confidently predict. What they could do was document what had been accomplished, ensure that the contributions of the 761st Tank Battalion were properly recorded, and hope that future generations would have the wisdom to look beyond the simplified narratives and understand the fuller context of innovation and achievement during this critical period. In November of 1945, the battalion finally received orders to return to the United States. As they prepared to leave Germany, Williams took one last look at Lady Luck, the Sherman tank that had carried them through so many engagements and served as the platform for a method that had changed tactical thinking. The tank bore the scars of 8 months of combat, its armor pocked with impacts that had been repaired and repainted but never fully erased. It seemed fitting somehow, a visible reminder that effectiveness came at a cost, that innovation emerged from necessity and pressure, that survival required both technical skill and something harder to quantify or teach. The journey home was long and gave Williams plenty of time to think about what the future might hold. He had heard stories from soldiers who had returned earlier about the mixed reception that African American veterans received, the appreciation for their service existing alongside the maintenance of discriminatory policies and social structures that denied them full citizenship. The GI Bill would provide educational opportunities and benefits that had previously been inaccessible, but those benefits would be administered in ways that often perpetuated existing inequalities. Progress was real, but incomplete, and the road ahead would require the same patience and discipline that had served Williams so well in combat. During the long voyage across the Atlantic, Williams spent considerable time writing detailed notes about the tactical method he had developed, documenting not just the mechanical procedures, but the underlying philosophy and psychological principles that made it effective. He understood that innovation had value beyond its immediate application, that the lessons learned in one context could inform thinking in entirely different situations. The discipline of holding fire when every instinct demanded action, the patience to wait for optimal conditions rather than accepting merely adequate ones, the psychological understanding that uncertainty could be weaponized as effectively as any piece of ordnance, all of these principles had applications far beyond armored warfare in European forests. His crewmates observed this documentation process with interest. Martinez asked one evening why Williams was investing so much effort in recording details that military debriefings had already captured. "Because the official reports focus on what happened," Williams explained, flipping through pages of notes covered in his careful handwriting. They document the engagements, the outcomes, the tactical effects, but they do not really capture why it worked, what made it possible for a single tank crew to disrupt enemy operations out of proportion to our actual combat power. That deeper understanding, that is what I want to preserve. Thompson, overhearing this conversation, added his own perspective. What Williams developed was not just a tactic, he said thoughtfully. It was a way of thinking about combat that challenged fundamental assumptions. The military trains us to be decisive, to act quickly and aggressively, to seize initiative through movement and firepower. Williams showed that sometimes the opposite approach could be even more effective, that calculated inaction could be more powerful than continuous action, that creating questions in the enemy's mind could be more devastating than providing answers through constant engagement. This philosophical discussion attracted other soldiers who had heard about the method and its results. A young lieutenant from another unit asked Williams to explain how someone could develop the mental discipline required to remain absolutely still while enemy forces advanced into engagement range. "It seems like it would require superhuman self-control," the lieutenant observed. "How do you train yourself to go against every instinct that combat has conditioned into you?" Williams considered the question carefully before responding, recognizing an opportunity to articulate something that had remained largely intuitive during the actual combat operations. "It is not about suppressing instinct," he explained slowly. "It is about understanding that instinct is not always correct, that the feeling of urgency to act immediately is itself a reaction that can be analyzed and questioned. When you grow up having to constantly calculate how your actions will be perceived and judged, you develop a kind of mental distance from your immediate impulses. You learn to observe your own reactions and decide whether they serve your actual objectives or just provide emotional relief in the moment." He paused, aware that he was touching on aspects of his experience that the young white lieutenant might not fully grasp. "In some ways," he continued, "the method emerged from skills I had been developing my entire life, long before I ever entered military service. The ability to remain calm and patient in situations where others might react emotionally or impulsively. The capacity to see multiple steps ahead and calculate how different choices might play out. The understanding that sometimes the most powerful response is not the most obvious one. These were not military skills originally. They were survival skills for navigating a society that did not grant me the same assumptions of goodwill or benefit of doubt that it extended to others." The lieutenant nodded slowly, beginning to understand that Williams's tactical innovation had roots that went deeper than military training or combat experience. "That is something they do not teach at officer candidate school," he said quietly. "How to think about combat from perspectives shaped by experiences outside the military mainstream. We learn standard doctrine, proven tactics, conventional approaches. But innovation like yours requires seeing problems from angles that standard training does not prepare us for." Hayes, who had been listening to this exchange while cleaning his service weapon, added his own observation. "Working with Williams taught all of us to question our assumptions," he said. "Not just about tactics, but about everything, about what constitutes strength, about when patience is more valuable than aggression, about how psychological factors can multiply or diminish physical advantages. Those lessons stayed with us, even in situations that had nothing to do with tank warfare. As the transport ship carried them westward across the Atlantic, Williams found himself engaged in numerous such conversations, each one helping him articulate and refine his understanding of what they had accomplished and why it mattered beyond the immediate military context. He began to see his tactical innovation as part of a larger pattern, a demonstration that valuable insights often emerged from those whose perspectives had been shaped by experiences outside the mainstream, whose life circumstances had forced them to develop different analytical frameworks and problem-solving approaches. This recognition carried implications that extended well beyond military applications. If marginalized perspectives could produce tactical innovations that conventional doctrine missed, what other insights might be lost or overlooked when societies failed to fully include and value all their members? How much potential innovation remained untapped because certain groups were systematically excluded, from positions where their unique perspectives could inform decision-making. These questions occupied Williams during the long Atlantic crossing, giving him a framework for thinking about the challenges that awaited him and his fellow African-American veterans upon their return home. The reception when they finally reached American shores was a study in contradictions. There were bands and banners, speeches about heroism and sacrifice, official recognition of the battalion's contributions to victory in Europe. But underneath the celebration, Williams and his fellow soldiers could feel the unchanged reality of the segregated society they had returned to defend. The same nation that praised their military service maintained laws and customs that denied them basic rights and dignity. The same military that had benefited from Williams's tactical innovations continued to operate segregated units and impose discriminatory policies on African-American personnel. Martinez, who as a Mexican-American soldier occupied a somewhat different but still marginalized position within American society, spoke with Williams about these contradictions during their first night back on American soil. "We fought against a regime whose racial ideology was explicit and extreme," he observed, "but we returned to a country whose racial discrimination is often denied or minimized, treated as somehow less severe because it is not stated quite so openly or implemented quite so systematically. The difference is real, but perhaps not as vast as people want to believe." Williams appreciated the observation and the solidarity it represented. He had found during his military service that bonds formed across different marginalized groups often reflected a shared understanding of how systemic discrimination operated, even when the specific manifestations varied. African American, Latino, Asian American and Native American soldiers in that era all faced versions of the same fundamental challenge, proving their worth to a nation that questioned their full humanity while simultaneously benefiting from their contributions and sacrifices. Thompson joined them, bringing news about the battalion's upcoming demobilization schedule and the process by which they would transition from active military service to veteran status. The benefits and opportunities theoretically available through the GI Bill were explained in official briefings, but the practical reality of accessing those benefits in a segregated society was left largely unaddressed. Williams understood that the same determination and innovative thinking that had served him in combat would be required to navigate the challenges of post-war life, that the struggle for equality would demand the same patience, discipline, and strategic thinking that his tactical method had embodied. In the weeks that followed, as the 761st Tank Battalion formally deactivated and its members dispersed to their home communities, Williams maintained contact with many of his former crewmates and fellow soldiers. They shared experiences and strategies for dealing with the transition to civilian life, for pursuing educational opportunities despite discriminatory obstacles, for maintaining the dignity and self-respect that their military service had reinforced even in the face of continuing injustice. These networks of mutual support reflected the same kind of coordinated effort and shared purpose that had made them effective in combat, adapted now to different but equally significant challenges. When the 761st Tank Battalion finally returned to the United States in December of 1945, they received an official welcome and recognition of their service. But Williams understood that this was only the beginning of a longer struggle. The skills he had developed, the innovative thinking he had demonstrated, the ability to see tactical problems from unique angles and develop creative solutions, all of these would be needed in the civil rights battles that lay ahead. The method that had proven so effective against external enemies would need to be adapted and applied to the challenge of transforming the society he had served and defended. In the years that followed, Williams remained connected to many of his fellow soldiers from the 761st, maintaining friendships forged in shared experience and mutual struggle. They watched as the military slowly began to integrate, as the tactical innovations of segregated units were absorbed into mainstream doctrine, as the specific contributions of African American soldiers were sometimes acknowledged, but more often folded into general narratives that obscured the context that had shaped them. The recognition Williams received for his tactical innovations was genuine and appreciated, but he never stopped being aware of how that recognition existed within larger structures that remained problematic and unjust. The method he had developed in the Ardennes, that combination of patience, discipline, and psychological understanding, continued to influence military tactical thinking for decades. Elements of it appeared in training manuals and doctrine publications, sometimes with attribution to the 761st Tank Battalion, sometimes without any acknowledgement of origins at all. Williams understood that this was in some ways inevitable, that innovations become incorporated into collective knowledge and their specific sources fade from memory. But he also believed that something important was lost when the context that produced innovations was forgotten, when the fuller story of how and why certain insights emerged was simplified or erased. In his later years, Williams occasionally spoke at military academies and tactical schools, invited to explain the thinking behind his method to new generations of officers. These opportunities gave him a platform to address not just the technical aspects of his innovations, but also the larger questions about leadership, perspective, and how diversity of experience could contribute to tactical and strategic effectiveness. He emphasized that the same forces that had made his military service more difficult, the discrimination and segregation that required constant navigation and calculation, had also helped shape the analytical skills and psychological insights that made his innovations possible. This was not an argument for maintaining discrimination, Williams always made clear, but rather an observation about how marginalized perspectives sometimes produced insights that conventional thinking missed. The lesson was not that injustice was productive, but that organizations and institutions that failed to fully include and value diverse experiences were limiting their own effectiveness, closing themselves off from sources of innovation and understanding that could prove decisive in critical moments. It was a complex argument, requiring careful articulation to avoid being misunderstood, but Williams believed it was important to make it explicitly rather than allowing his contributions to be celebrated without acknowledgement of the fuller context. The specific numbers associated with Williams's method, the estimated 100 enemy vehicles stopped or destroyed, the multiple German advances disrupted, the tactical approaches that had to be abandoned or substantially altered because of the defensive effectiveness his innovation produced, all of these figures were eventually documented and included in military historical records. But the deeper impact, the way his method had challenged conventional tactical assumptions and demonstrated the value of psychological understanding in combat operations, was harder to quantify and therefore easier to overlook or minimize in official histories. Williams understood that his story was in many ways emblematic of larger patterns in American history, the way marginalized groups had consistently contributed to national success, even while being denied full recognition or equal treatment, the way innovation often emerged from those forced to find creative solutions because conventional paths were closed to them, the way individual achievement existed in tension with systemic injustice. His military service and tactical innovations were real and significant, but they did not resolve these larger contradictions. They merely illustrated them with particular clarity. The silence that had been so central to his method, the patient discipline of holding fire while enemy forces advanced, the psychological pressure created by the absence of expected action, all of this had required a form of strength that went beyond physical courage or technical skill. It had required the ability to remain still and focused while every instinct pushed toward movement and action, to trust in a method that contradicted conventional doctrine, to maintain certainty in the face of uncertainty. These were skills that Williams had been developing long before he ever entered military service. Skills shaped by a lifetime of navigating a society that demanded patience and discipline from those it marginalized, while claiming to value individual merit and achievement. When Williams passed away in 1998, his obituary in military publications noted his tactical innovations and their lasting impact on defensive doctrine. The method he had developed in the Ardennes was mentioned specifically, along with recognition of his service and the numerous commendations he had received. But the fuller story, the complex interplay of discrimination and innovation, the way his method had emerged from experiences and perspectives shaped by segregation and injustice, the larger questions about what is lost when society fails to fully include and value all of its members, these elements received less attention, simplified into conventional narratives about individual achievement and military effectiveness. By the time of his passing, Williams had witnessed profound changes in American society and the American military. The integration of the armed forces, begun by executive order in 1948, had transformed the segregated structure within which he had served. His own children and grandchildren had opportunities that would have been unimaginable during his Mississippi childhood. Yet Williams had also understood that progress remained incomplete. The elimination of formal segregation had not automatically produced genuine equality. Williams had lived long enough to see his tactical innovations incorporated into doctrine without always being credited by name, to watch as the specific context that shaped his thinking was gradually forgotten. His grandchildren, particularly his oldest granddaughter, who became a military historian, worked to preserve and properly contextualize his legacy. She conducted extensive interviews with surviving members of the 761st Tank Battalion, gathering first-hand accounts that provided texture and depth, often missing from official records. She researched German archives and after-action reports, documenting the specific impact that Williams's method had on enemy operations during the Ardennes campaign. She worked to ensure that future generations would understand not just what Williams accomplished, but why his innovation mattered, how it reflected experiences shaped by navigating a discriminatory society, how it demonstrated the value of diverse perspectives in solving complex problems. Through her research, Williams's granddaughter uncovered details that even he had not fully known during his lifetime. She found German intelligence reports from late December 1944 that specifically discussed the unusual American defensive tactics encountered in certain Ardennes sectors. She located training materials from the 1950s that incorporated elements of Williams's method, sometimes with attribution to the 761st Tank Battalion, but often presented as general tactical principles without acknowledgement of origins. She discovered testimony from other tank crews who had adopted Williams's approach, describing how it had saved their lives and increased their effectiveness. She found letters that Williams had written to his family during the European campaign, revealing the thought processes that accompanied his tactical innovations, the doubt and pressure he felt, the determination to prove that African American soldiers could excel at the highest levels of military performance. Perhaps most significantly, Williams's granddaughter worked to place his story within the broader context of African American military service. She documented how the 761st Tank Battalion was part of a long tradition of African American military units serving with distinction while facing discrimination. She showed how Williams's tactical innovation fit within a pattern of African American soldiers, finding creative solutions to challenges. Her work helped ensure that Williams's legacy was preserved not as a simple story of individual achievement, but as a more complex narrative that illuminated larger truths about innovation and discrimination. She presented papers at military history conferences and published articles that examined African American contributions to World War II. Through these efforts, she helped keep alive the fuller story that her grandfather had worried might be forgotten as time passed. His former crewmates, those who survived to attend his memorial service, understood the fuller context in ways that official histories sometimes missed. They had witnessed firsthand how Williams's method had emerged not just from tactical analysis, but from a lifetime of learning to see angles others missed, to find advantages in situations where conventional approaches were unavailable, to transform limitations into strengths through creativity and discipline. They had benefited from his innovations, while also understanding the costs he had paid and the barriers he had overcome to develop and implement them. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.